This is a story about time. Not the kind that is measured in seconds and minutes, but the kind that is measured in heartbeats. The kind that can stop in a single, shattering moment. And the kind that can stretch a lie into a lifetime. This is the story of a man who fixed clocks and broke time. My name is May, and this is where what you don't see becomes what you feel. 1. The Museum of Stopped Time. Samuel was 72, and his world was a museum of stopped time. His small, cluttered workshop was a sanctuary of silence, broken only by the gentle, rhythmic ticking of a dozen clocks. Each one was a patient, a life he had saved. He could resurrect a grandfather clock that had been silent for a century, his gnarled, steady hands moving with a surgeon's precision. He could coax a heartbeat out of a watch that had been drowned, burned, or crushed. He was a master of time. But his own time had stopped 30 years ago. 30 years, 6 months, and 12 days since the accident. The day he lost his wife, Sarah, and his 7-year-old daughter, Lily. He remembered the rain, the screech of tires, the impossible, final silence. He had been driving. He had survived. They had not. His life since then had been a long, slow, quiet penance. He lived in the same house, a house that was no longer a home, but a mausoleum. He kept Lily's room exactly as it was, her small, colorful drawings still taped to the wall, her favorite teddy bear still sitting on her pillow. He would stand in the doorway sometimes, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, and try to remember the sound of her laughter. But it was a ghost of a sound, a faint echo from another life. He found his only solace in his work, the intricate, delicate dance of gears and springs, the logic, the order, the precision. In a world that had spun into chaos, the inside of a watch was a place of perfect, predictable order. He could fix time for others, but he could not fix his own. 2. The broken locket. It happened on a Thursday. A young woman he had never seen before walked into his shop. She was in her late 20s, with kind, sad eyes. She was holding a small, velvet pouch. "Mr. Allister?" she asked. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Samuel," he corrected her, his voice rough from disuse. "Samuel," she repeated. "My name is Lena. I was told you were the best." She opened the pouch and placed a small, silver pocket watch on the counter. It was a woman's watch, elegant and old-fashioned. It was also completely destroyed. The crystal was shattered, the case dented and twisted. "I don't think this can be fixed," Samuel said, his voice flat. "I know," Lena said. "I don't want it fixed. There's something inside, something small, rattling around. I need you to get it out for me." Samuel picked up the watch. It was cold and heavy in his hand. He could hear the faint metallic rattle she was talking about. He took it to his workbench and picked up his tools. He had opened thousands of watches in his life. It was a familiar, comforting ritual. He carefully pried open the back of the watch. The movement was a mangled wreck of twisted metal, But nestled in the wreckage was a tiny silver locket. It was no bigger than his thumbnail. It was the source of the rattling sound. He gently lifted it out. It was tarnished with age, but he could see an engraving on the front. 2 initials, intertwined, S and L. His breath caught. He turned the locket over. On the back, there was a date. October 12th, 1993. The date of the accident. His hands started to shake. He fumbled with the clasp of the locket. It sprang open. Inside were 2 tiny, faded photographs. One was of a young woman with a bright, beautiful smile. Sarah, his wife. The other was of a little girl with pigtails and a missing front tooth. Lily, his daughter. He stared at the locket, his heart a frantic, terrified bird in his chest. He looked up at Lena. Her kind, sad eyes were filled with tears. "The watch belonged to my grandmother," she said. "She was a nurse. She was at the scene of the accident." 3. The whisper. Samuel couldn't speak. He just stared at the locket, at the tiny, smiling faces of his wife and daughter. A lifetime of grief. A lifetime of carefully constructed walls was crumbling around him. "My grandmother was the first one to reach your car," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. "She told me the story 100 times. She said she never forgot it." Samuel looked up at her. "Why?" he managed to choke out. "Why did she have this? Your wife. Sarah. She was holding it when she died," Lena said. "My grandmother took it. She didn't want it to be lost. She always meant to give it back to you. But she was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Samuel asked. Lena hesitated. She took a deep breath. "My grandmother, she heard something at the scene. Something your daughter said." Samuel's blood ran cold. "What?" he whispered. "What did she say?" "She didn't die instantly," Lena said, her voice trembling. "She was alive for a few minutes. My grandmother held her, and she whispered something my grandmother never told anyone. Until she told me, right before she died." Samuel felt a wave of nausea. He had always imagined Lily's last moments. He had tortured himself with the thought of her, scared and alone, but he had never imagined this. "What did she say?" he repeated, his voice a raw, desperate plea. Lena looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, profound sorrow. She said she was sorry. She said, "It was my fault. I pulled the wheel." Samuel stared at her. The words didn't make sense. It was a lie, a mistake. It had to be. "There was another car," he said, his voice shaking. "A drunk driver. He ran us off the road." Lena shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There was no other car, Samuel. My grandmother was the first one there. There was only your car. She said your daughter told her you and your wife were fighting, arguing. She said Lily was scared, and she pulled the wheel. The workshop, his sanctuary of silence, was spinning. The ticking of the clocks was a deafening roar. 30 years. 30 years of a story he had told himself. A story that had become the foundation of his life. A story of a tragic accident. A story of a drunk driver who had stolen his family from him. A lie. It was all a lie. He looked at the locket in his hand. The smiling faces of his wife and daughter. And he remembered. He remembered the fight. The angry words. The shouting. He had been having an affair. Sarah had found out. They were on their way to her mother's house. He had been trying to convince her to forgive him. He had buried that memory. He had buried it so deep he had forgotten it was even there. But now, it was all coming back. The rain, the shouting, Lily's small, scared voice from the back seat. "Stop fighting," she had cried. "Please, stop fighting." And then, the screech of tires. The impossible, final silence. He had killed them. His betrayal had killed them. And his daughter had died thinking it was her fault. He let out a sound. A raw animal sound of a pain so deep, so absolute. It had no words. He doubled over, the locket clutched in his hand, and he shattered, for the weight of a lie. Lena stayed with him. She made him tea. She sat with him in the silence of his shattered world. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She just sat with him. A quiet, compassionate witness to his agony. He learned that her grandmother, Eleanor, had been a young, idealistic nurse on that rainy night. She had been haunted by Lily's last words her entire life. She had wanted to tell Samuel the truth, but she couldn't bear to add to his pain. So, she kept the secret. A secret that festered, that poisoned her own life, with a quiet, corrosive guilt. She carried that weight with her always, Lena said. She had a family, a life. But that night was a shadow that never truly left her. She always felt a quiet, lingering guilt. Samuel listened, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He had not been the only victim of that night. Eleanor, the kind, compassionate nurse, had been a casualty too. She had carried the weight of his sin for 30 years. He looked at the locket, the smiling faces of his wife and daughter. They were not just memories anymore. They were accusations. He had built his life on a foundation of lies. A lie he had told himself. A lie the world had accepted. A lie that had allowed him to be a tragic hero, a noble victim of fate. But he was not a hero. He was a villain. The villain of his own story. 5. The unwinding of time. In the days that followed, Samuel's workshop became a tomb. The ticking of the clocks, once a comfort, was now a torment. Each tick was a reminder of the seconds, the minutes, the hours, the years he had lived in a lie. Each tick was a judgment. He stopped working. He stopped eating. He just sat at his workbench, the locket in his hand, and let the waves of guilt wash over him. He remembered the affair, the cheap motels, the whispered lies, the thrill of the forbidden. He had been a fool. A selfish, arrogant fool. He had broken his wife's heart. He had terrified his daughter. And he had killed them both. The grief he had carried for 30 years was a clean, noble thing, a monument to a lost love. But this was a different kind of grief, a dirty, shameful, corrosive thing. It was a poison that was eating him alive from the inside out. He thought about ending it. He thought about joining his wife and daughter in the silence. But he knew he didn't deserve that. He didn't deserve peace. He deserved this agony, this endless ticking torment. 6. The first tick of a new clock one morning. He woke up and knew he couldn't go on like this. He had to do something. He had to find a way to atone. He went to his workshop. He picked up a clock that had been sitting on his bench for months. A beautiful, intricate carriage clock that had been silent for decades. He had told the owner it was beyond repair. He opened it up. He looked at the tangled mess of gears and springs, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of something, a flicker of purpose. He started to work. His hands were shaking, but he forced them to be steady. He worked for hours, for days. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He just worked. He was not just fixing a clock. He was fighting for his own soul. He was trying to turn back time, to undo what he had done, to find a way to forgive himself. And then, one afternoon, it happened. A faint, hesitant tick. And then another. And another. The clock was alive. It was a small, fragile sound, but it was a sound of hope, a sound of life. He listened to the ticking, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt a crack in the ice around his heart. He had not fixed the past. He could never fix the past. But he had fixed this clock. He had brought something broken back to life. It was not forgiveness. It was not redemption. But it was a start. It was the first tick of a new clock. The first tick of the rest of his life. He knew he would carry the weight of his sin for the rest of his days, but he also knew that he had to carry it. He had to live for Sarah, for Lily, and for Eleanor, the kind, compassionate nurse who had carried his secret for so long. He had to live so that their stories would not be forgotten. He had to live so that their time would not have been in vain. He had to live. And so he did. 7. Atonement. Samuel didn't just fix the clock. He created a masterpiece. He spent weeks restoring it, polishing the brass, mending the delicate hand-painted porcelain face. When he was finished, it was not just a clock. It was a work of art, a testament to his skill, his patience, his love. He called the owner, an elderly woman who had inherited the clock from her grandmother. She was overjoyed. She offered to pay him, but he refused. "There is no charge," he said. It was a privilege. He started to do this with all the clocks that were brought to him. He didn't just fix them, he restored them. He poured his heart and soul into each one. He was not just a watchmaker anymore. He was an artist, a historian, a keeper of stories. Each clock was a life, a story, a legacy, and he was their guardian. He also started to talk to his customers. He would ask them about the clocks they brought him. Where did they get them? Who did they belong to? What stories did they hold? He learned that every clock had a story of love, of loss, of joy, of sorrow. He was no longer just fixing the mechanics of time. He was mending the broken hearts of the people who owned them. He was not just a watchmaker. He was a healer. 8. The full circle. 15 years passed. Samuel was 87 now, frail but still surrounded by the gentle ticking of his clocks. One day, a young man in his late teens walked into the shop. He had Lena's kind, sad eyes. "Mr. Allister?" he asked. "Samuel," he replied, his voice softer now. "My name is Jacob," the young man said. "My mother was Lena. She passed away last year from cancer. She told me to find you. She wanted you to have this." Jacob handed him a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was a journal. Lena's journal. "She wrote in it her whole life," Jacob said. "She wanted you to know what happened after she left your shop that day." Samuel's eyes filled with tears. He looked at the locket, at the smiling face of the young woman who had shattered his world, and then, in a strange, heartbreaking way, had saved him. He had never seen her again after that day. He had wanted to. He had wanted to thank her, but he had been too ashamed, too broken. Now her son was here, and he was holding a piece of her story in his hands. "I can't fix the watch," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I can fix this." That night, Samuel sat in his workshop and read Lena's journal. He learned that after their meeting, Lena had felt a profound sense of release. The secret that had haunted her family for a generation was finally out. She had gone on to live a full, happy life. She had married a man named James, had a son, Jacob, and had become a nurse, just like her grandmother. She wrote that meeting Samuel had taught her the importance of truth, of compassion, of forgiveness. In the final entry, written just weeks before she died, she wrote directly to him, "Samuel, if my son finds you, I want you to know that you gave me a gift that day. You gave my grandmother peace. You gave me a future. And you taught me that even the most broken things can be mended. I hope you found your own peace. I hope you learned to forgive yourself. You were a good man who made a terrible mistake, and you deserve to be happy." "Thank you," the young man said, his voice filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you so much." He turned to leave, but then he stopped. He looked at Samuel. Samuel closed the journal, tears streaming down his face. He had spent 30 years living in a prison of his own making, a prison of guilt, of shame, of self-hatred. But now, in a single, shattering moment, he had been set free. He was not a villain. He was not a hero. He was just a man A man who had made a terrible mistake. A man who had paid for it every single day of his life. A man who had finally been forgiven. He went to the window and looked out at the world. The sun was shining. The birds were singing. The world was full of life. And for the first time in 30 years, he felt a part of it. He had spent his life fixing clocks. But in the end, it was time that had fixed him. He had broken time, and time had made him whole again. 9. The echo of a whisper. Samuel didn't just feel forgiven. He felt seen. For 30 years, he had been a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life. Lena's grandmother, Eleanor, had seen his pain, and in her silence had protected him. Lena had seen his brokenness, and had offered him a terrible, cleansing truth. And now, her son had offered him a grace he never believed he deserved. He began to truly live. Not just exist, but live. He started taking walks in the park. He would sit on a bench and watch the children play, their laughter a sound that no longer brought him pain, but a strange, bittersweet joy. He started to talk to his neighbors, to learn their names, their stories. He was no longer an island. He was part of the world again. His workshop changed too. It was no longer a tomb, but a place of life. He would play music while he worked, the melodies weaving in and out of the ticking of the clocks. He would open the door and let the sunlight stream in. He even got a cat, a small, ginger stray that would curl up on his workbench and watch him work with a quiet, sleepy curiosity. He was not happy. Happiness was a word that belonged to another life, another man. But he was at peace. He had made peace with his ghosts. He had learned to live with the weight of his past, not as a burden, but as a part of who he was. A constant, aching reminder of the fragility of life, of the preciousness of time. 10. The final tick. Years passed. Samuel grew old. His hands, once so steady, began to tremble. His eyesight began to fail. He knew his time was coming to an end. He was not afraid. He had lived a long, quiet life of atonement. He had mended broken clocks and broken hearts. He had honored the memory of his wife, his daughter, and the kind, compassionate nurse who had carried his secret for so long. One evening, he sat in his workshop, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. He was holding the locket, the tiny, smiling faces of his wife and daughter looking up at him. He closed his eyes. He could hear the gentle, rhythmic ticking of the clocks, a symphony of time that had been his life's work. He thought of Lily's last words. "I'm sorry. It was my fault." A lifetime of guilt for a crime she did not commit. He hoped, with all his heart, that she knew the truth now, that she was at peace. He thought of Sarah. He hoped she had forgiven him. He hoped she knew how much he had loved her, how much he had regretted his betrayal. He thought of Eleanor, the nurse. He hoped she knew that her secret had not been in vain, that it had, in its own strange, heartbreaking way, saved him. And he thought of Lena, the young woman with the kind, sad eyes, who had brought him the terrible, cleansing truth. He hoped she had found happiness. He hoped she had found peace. He took one last look at the locket. He closed it, the tiny clasp clicking shut. He held it to his heart. He closed his eyes, and he listened to the ticking of the clocks. Slower now, fainter. Tick, tock, tick. And then silence. The clocks in Samuel's workshop were still ticking, but the watchmaker's time had stopped. Epilogue. The story of a clock years later. A young couple walked into the old, dusty workshop. It had been preserved as a museum, a tribute to the legendary watchmaker who had worked there for over 50 years. They were there to see one clock in particular, a beautiful, intricate carriage clock that sat in the center of the room, its gentle, rhythmic ticking a soft, steady heartbeat. The young woman was a historian. She had been researching the life of Samuel Alistair, the watchmaker. She had uncovered the story of the accident, of the locket, of the nurse who had kept his secret for so long. She told the story to her husband, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. She told him about the man who had lived a lie for 30 years, and the woman who had carried his burden. She told him about the daughter who had died with a terrible secret, and the wife who had never known the full truth. He spent the rest of his life atoning, she said. He fixed clocks for free. He created masterpieces out of broken things. He listened to people's stories. He mended their broken hearts. She pointed to the carriage clock. This was the first clock he fixed after he learned the truth. He said it was the first tick of the rest of his life. The young couple stood in silence, listening to the ticking of the clock. It was not just a clock. It was a story of love, of loss, of guilt, of forgiveness, a story of a man who had broken time, and then, in the end, had been made whole by it. And in the quiet, dusty workshop, surrounded by the gentle, rhythmic ticking of 100 clocks, they understood. They understood that time does not heal all wounds, but it can, if we let it, teach us how to live with them. It can teach us how to find beauty in the broken places. It can teach us how to find hope in the heart of despair. And it can teach us that the most powerful stories are not the ones that are told in grand, sweeping gestures, but the ones that are whispered in the quiet, secret chambers of the human heart. Stories like Samuel's. Stories that tick on, long after we are gone.